gentlemen, join MythVision's Patreon not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patreon, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision grow. Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald. I have a Patreon fan, Tudor. I don't want to butcher his last name. It's something I probably wouldn't be able to pronounce. Thank you for supporting. He says, for Dr. MacDonald, questions from a former Romanian Orthodox Christian. Very grateful for have read some of his excellent work. 1. Can you tell us more of the ways in which the Byzantines saw the relationship between the New Testament and the Hellenistic world? Did the Byzantines still learn Greek using Homer? Did they still breathe Homer, so to speak? What do you think of the bad reputation the Byzantines have in modern times? Is it justified? Was Edward Gibbon right in his decline and fall of the Roman Empire? Has there been any noticeable impact so far of your work in Greece, Russia, or Eastern Europe? Are there translations or plans for translations of your work in the main languages used by the Eastern Orthodox churches? I am certain the demand would be great. Thank you, Derek, for bringing quality scholarship on the Bible to a larger audience.
First name is Tudor, is that right?
Tudor Rebengius, Rebengius.
Okay, that's such a rich question, Tudor, and I'll have to peck away at things I remember, and I'm going to require Derek to fill me in on some of the things I may not remember. One of my books, I'll tell you a story. I was visiting Greece, and my wife and I went into a bookstore next to the university in Athens. And I was wearing a name badge because I was at a conference. And the person who was there at the book sale, the salesman, looked at me and he said, "Oh, you're Dennis MacDonald. Are you the same Dennis MacDonald that wrote the Homeric epics and the Gospel of Mark?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And he honestly stood up, reached over to a bookshelf without having to move his feet, and pulled a Greek translation of that book out and said, "This is on the house." So it is actually used as a textbook in Athens at the university in their religion department.
Wow.
I also have a contract for a translation of the Dionysian Gospel into Greek that should be available within the year, maybe in a few weeks. So some of my work does have traction. It does not have traction, though, among the Orthodox, because it is so radical. If it's radical for European Protestants, it's very radical for Byzantines. And you, Tudor, probably know more about Byzantine history than I do, but it's a tragic history. And it's a tragedy already with the split of the empire way back when. And the Byzantine tradition became more anti-intellectual at a later time because of issues of social identity, especially the Ottoman Empire and the interest among Armenians, for example, and others, for a kind of a theological orthodoxy. That's why they're called Orthodox traditions, because they don't tolerate very much deviation in theology. And I think that's unfortunate, and it's painted them into boxes that aren't congenial to the Western world. But we have a time in Byzantine history that's sometimes called the Byzantine Renaissance. And generally the dates are somewhere like between maybe the 7th and the 12th centuries. And during this time, Byzantine intellectuals continued to read Homer and to understand the Gospels in the context of Greek poetry, because when for some of them they were still learning their Greek from Homeric epics. But what became a problem is that they wanted to put the Gospels into poetry at this time. And we find several examples of it. The Homerochentones, that is, the Homeric stitchings that come out of the Byzantine world, retell gospel stories by using lines from Homer that retell the same stories that inspired them originally. These Homerochentones have, as far as I know, never been translated entirely into English. And I've done a lot of the translating myself at places where you can see that they are retelling the story of the triumphal entry by using lines that come out of Odysseus's entry into the city of the Phaeacians. They retell the story of the Gerasene demoniac by using stories that come out of Polyphemus and the Circe episodes. And later on, these texts were used in schools among monks because they needed to learn Homeric language, but apparently the monks were afraid of people becoming themselves polytheists and understanding the gods to fornicate with mortals and to chase women or men and to participate in warfare. So the moral horizon of the Gospels was what they wanted to preserve, but they used Homeric lines to help students learn them. And apparently this was common even in Ireland in the preservation of some of these texts, although I'm not an authority on the preservation of the Homerochentones. We also have the Christus Patiens, which is a story about the death of Jesus, his suffering, Christus Patiens, the suffering Christ. And they use lines from Euripides intentionally. The author says, people have read Euripides with a pious ear. I'm going to retell the story of the Passion of Jesus using lines ripped out of Euripides. And the mourning of the Theotokos at the end of the document is almost taken verbatim out of the Bacchae and the prologue of the Bacchae. So there are other examples too. We have a Byzantine recension of the Gospel of Nicodemus that retells the story of the mourning of the women at the tomb and the rescue of Jesus' corpse by Joseph of Arimathea, by using lines from the Iliad in order to put the lamentations of the Marys and Salome on their lips, but imitating Andromache and Helen's laments and Hecuba's laments. And they retell the story of Pilate's rescue by using lines from Priam's rescue of Hector's corpse. So in this time of the Byzantine Renaissance, you had still people learning Homer apparently from schools, sufficient that they could imitate these stories, but they wanted to replace the questionable moral stories of Homer with ones that were more edifying for the faithful, and retold gospel stories many times with the same lines that inspired the things originally. In my mimetic synopsis, I have extensive footnotes that translate the Homerochentones, showing that these Byzantines were alert to these similarities. Now they're not in the Western tradition, because the Western tradition is dominated by Western languages, especially Latin. And Homer was, after the first century of the Common Era, or the early second century, not very popular in the West. So they couldn't see in their Gospels these echoes of Homer. But you ought to be proud of the Byzantine tradition, especially that earlier time when these scholars were bona fide intellectuals. And they knew their Homer, and they knew their Bible, and they had their own form of mimesis by combining the biblical narratives with the Homeric lines that inspired them.
Quick question on that. We talked about this yesterday. They made it like forbidden. Who was it that stopped it from being something that was being taught in Greek?
Oh, Julian, the so-called apostate, in the 4th century, issued a declaration that Christians could not teach Greek culture in schools because they were using Homer and Christianizing Homer. And so there's a wonderful line in which he laments that we pagans are being shot with arrows that are feathered with our own feathers. That is, that Christians are using Homer now to lambast and to criticize pagan religion. Now, if that wasn't widespread, there would be no reason for Julian to make an empire-wide refutation. And pagan and Christian intellectuals objected to it but apparently Christian teachers were allegorizing and moralizing Homer in such a way that the Homeric epics became not vehicles for Greek identity, but vehicles for Christian identity. Now, that could be allegorized for these Christian virtues. We have only a few examples of that survive, but it must have been more widespread in the 4th century than we know.
Interesting. Thank you.